there's no evidence. And then I read this and I'm like, oh my gosh. It wasn't near-death experiences that led me to faith. It was this.
The crucifixion.
Yeah.
Kind of the journey to it. What did it mean? Just start wherever you want to start with that.
Yeah, I would go back a little further to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus, it says, sweated blood. And I read that when I was a skeptic and thought, that just shows this is just fantasy land. This is just a literary device to suggest that he was under stress or something. And then I find there are like 70 cases in medical journals of this medical phenomenon called hematidrosis, which is when you're under extreme stress, your capillaries in your sweat glands break down and blood seeps in and you sweat, a combination of sweat and blood. And so there's actually a medical support for that description of Jesus sweating blood. But the other thing that happens with that medical phenomenon is that it makes your skin ever more sensitive. And so Jesus was set up for an incredibly painful next step, which was being flogged by the Roman soldiers. Now, there's only like a sentence or so in the Bible that says he was flogged, but that was a incredibly brutal experience, that he was stripped, that he was tied to a post, that he was beaten with a whip that had jagged bits of sheep bone embedded in it and balls of lead. The balls of lead would break open the back. The jagged sheep bone would cut the flesh. There's a eyewitness to a Roman flogging who described it this way. He said, the sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles and tendons and bowels of the victim were laid open to exposure. So this was a horrific beating. Yeah, torture. It was a horrific beating that he endured. And it put him in what's called hypovolemic shock, which is shock from a great loss of blood. And you can see evidence of that in the fact he couldn't carry the crossbeam of the cross very far. And also he had great thirst and so forth. So here he is already in critical condition before he's even crucified. And then nails are driven through his wrists, not through the hand, because it would just tear, but driven through his wrists and through his feet. He's hoisted on the cross. And what happens when you're in that position is that it puts incredible stresses on your chest muscles. So you can't breathe. And so you're hanging on that cross. You're having trouble breathing. You can take air in, but you not expel the air. And so you're on the cross, and the only way you can continue to breathe is by lessening the stress on your chest muscles. The only way you can do that is push up with your feet, which of course have a spike through them, and your bloodied back is now scraping against the coarse wood of the cross. And you let up, and you can exhale, and then you inhale again, and then you settle down, and then you just keep going through that motion time and time again until you can't do it anymore. And your acidic qualities are building up in your blood. Your heart rate is now getting irregular, and you actually end up dying of asphyxiation. Ultimately, can't breathe. That causes your heart to fail. And what's interesting as well is that this would cause fluid to collect around your heart and around your lungs. And so when the spear was thrust into him to make sure he was dead, John interestingly describes water and blood coming out. And people think, oh, well, that's just a metaphor for baptism or something. No. That is what would happen. The pericardial effusion, in other words, the membrane of fluid around the heart and the lung was punctured, and what looked like water would come out as well as blood, and he was declared dead. Now, I used to think like a skeptic, well, wait a minute, maybe he survived the cross somehow. Maybe he fainted and they thought he was dead. Well, that's been disproven 1,000 times in many different ways, but the Journal of the American Medical Association several years ago published an evaluation of the death of Jesus Christ, and the conclusion was, quote, clearly the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted. So, and in fact, the atheist New Testament scholar, Gerhard Ludemann, says it's indisputable that Jesus was truly dead after being crucified. We have no record anywhere of anyone ever surviving a full Roman crucifixion. And not only do we have multiple reports of his death in the documents of the New Testament, we got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible that confirm his execution. So we have Josephus, a first century Jewish historian who worked for the Romans. Tacitus, another early historian, Mirabar Serapion, Lucian, even the Jewish Talmud admits that he was executed. So this idea that somehow Jesus survived the cross and was revived by the cool, damp air of the tomb is ridiculous.
Have you guys seen the movie? I think it's called The Passion.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Would you say that was pretty accurate?
I would say it approached how bad it was, but didn't fully capture it. I don't think it could have, because people would have been vomiting in the audience watching if they had taken it to the, don't you think?
Yes.
If they had, yeah.
Well, and so this is what actually convinced me when I was a skeptic, and learning this. So as you know, my father's dying of cancer. I read this first research on near-death experiences. I'd always said, well, Jesus is probably a legend. God, who can know? There's no evidence. And then I read this and I'm like, oh my gosh, maybe this is evidence. And because so many were talking about in their near-death experience this God of light who is love, and even Jesus, I was like, well, maybe I should be more open to reading the Bible. So I start reading the Bible. I go to a small group, and I'm asking my questions and wrestling. And here's what I learned, that actually, it wasn't near-death experiences that led me to faith. It was this. Everything Lee just explained is history. Historians, like that are not believers, they will not deny these things. These are facts, okay? But all that God told in advance. Jesus was a man with an address in history. I think you said that, didn't you? Quoting my good friend. But the who, the where, the how, the why, the what, the why, all of that God foretold so that we would know this is real. This is not myth. So for instance, in Isaiah, in the book of Isaiah, and remember Isaiah, we found a complete copy of the book of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948, complete copy that you can read online if you can read the Hebrew, but you can read a translation. It reads exactly like our modern day Bible.
And that's how many years before the death of Jesus? 600 years or so?
So 780 years before Jesus, Isaiah writes all these prophecies. Now we have...
What prophecies?
I'm going to tell you. But we have a surviving copy of the whole scroll of Isaiah that carbon dates to 150 to 300 years before Jesus. So this is a copy of Isaiah's original, written in 780 BC, but we have it in a museum. It tours the United States. You can go read it online, exactly what it says. And here's what it says. Isaiah 9, that to Galilee a light has come, for a child is born, a son is given, and he will be called Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So this is Judaism. So you don't call any human God. There's only one God, and he's the eternal Yahweh, the I am, the eternal self-existent one. And yet here in Judaism in about 780 BC, and even before that with Moses, is this foretelling of this time that God is going to enter into humanity and reveal himself in the form of a son, a child, and come to Galilee. Okay, so that now of the whole world, this is a very specific place, right? Specific identification of a human. He's going to come from the lineage of David. If you've ever read the Bible, you always wonder, why do they put all these stupid genealogies in there? Because it's relating back. It's showing that this is in fact what happened, okay? So that's the who, a little bit of the where. Actually in Micah 5:2, it also says that Bethlehem is going to, so though it's the least of the villages, from you will come a ruler over Israel whose days are from eternity. Okay, so who comes from days of eternity, right? So he's going to come from Bethlehem and Galilee. So that's the where. Then you have the when. So in the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel is praying. They're in captivity in Babylon, the Jewish people. Okay, so this is in like the 500s, 400s BC. Daniel's praying, what's going to happen to us? And an angel, Gabriel, comes to him and says, I've come to tell you what's going to happen to the Jewish people. And he's saying, till all human history is fulfilled, okay? And he says, from the decree of the rebuilding of Jerusalem, okay, Jerusalem had been wiped out by the Babylonians. This is real history. Yeah. Mm-hmm. From the decree of the rebuilding of Jerusalem until Meshach, which is what we translate Messiah, until the anointed one, the Messiah comes, and then he gives a timeline, and literally a timeline. Like he says they're going to be 7 plus 42 sevens. And I think there's a good reason to believe there's sevens of years. So 49 times 7 years, 483 years from the starting point of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Now, interestingly, in Ezra 7, we have that decree. It was Artaxerxes, who's a Persian king, and the decree, though the Bible's written, the Old Testament in Hebrew, this decree is written in Aramaic. So that's the language of the Persians. So it's literally the decree just put into the text of Ezra. And it was in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. You know, Encyclopedia Britannica tells us when Artaxerxes ruled, started in 465. So literally we know from 457, go 483 years, and Messiah's going to come. Well, that's 27 AD. It's the when. And by the way, even if you don't do the church math and don't follow that, the angel goes on and says to Daniel, this is all in Daniel 9, he says, the Messiah will come and be killed, and then the ruler will come who will destroy the city and the temple. Okay, so the city of Jerusalem and the temple. Okay, so think about this. That happened too. 70 AD, the Roman general Titus wipes out the city, destroys a temple, and the angel says the Messiah will be killed before that happens. So this is real history.
So if Jesus isn't the Messiah, there will never be a Messiah.
No. And then in Isaiah 53, now remember all this, we have a copy predating Jesus. So it wasn't doctored up after the fact. That's what I initially said as a skeptic, like, Jesus came and then they just redacted the text. And no. Proof, no. In Isaiah 53, it says, and actually in 52, it paints a picture. It says that he was they're talking about the suffering servant. That's what he's called. And see, that's what we don't realize is Jesus is going to come and rule, but first he had to come and suffer. And that was foretold. And it said he will be so marred and disfigured like no human before him. He was barely recognizable, I think is the way it says. And then it says, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Okay, so the idea is like, through Jesus, we're not seeing all of the infinite creator God who can't be contained in time and space. It's like his arm reaching into our reality. And it said he grew up before him. So he grew up before God, the eternal Father. He was despised and rejected by mankind. He was pierced for our transgressions.
This is before crucifixion was ever implemented.
Even known. This is before the Romans invented crucifixion.
And Psalm says his bones were out of joint, which is what happens to your shoulders when you're crucified.
Yeah, and it says why. So it says what he will do. And it says, by his wounds we were healed, and for our iniquities he took on our punishment. Because, and this is Isaiah 53, all of us like sheep have wandered off. We've gone astray. But God laid on him the sins of us all.
See, this might go into some of the legal stuff that I was talking about earlier, with the whatever you want to call the legalities of the spiritual realm. I mean, why did he have to come and go through that to save us?
Well, before we go there, I want to tie to what Lee was just saying, because even Jesus on the cross, when these are all real things, and he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Well, that harkens back to
Who cried that out?
Jesus.
And that's
explain
actually a
it.
quote. In the old days, back then, they didn't have numbers on the Psalms. So they would quote the first line to indicate, I'm applying this Psalm. So here Jesus is on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the first line of Psalm 22.
A Psalm of David in 1000 BC, 1,000 years before.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Foretelling, the bones be out of joint and so forth. This idea of the crucifixion, before crucifixion was even invented.
Yeah, he says, they pierced my hands and my feet. They circle me like a pack of dogs. They divide my garments among them. The soldiers cast lots to see who would get his cloak. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd. He was thirsty.
Which is a product of hypovolemic shock.
My heart has turned to wax within me. Okay, so that's what Lee studied with Dr. Methrel. You want to?
Yeah, Dr. Alexander Metherell, who is like the world's leading authority on the crucifixion of Jesus. I interviewed with my book, The Case for Christ. And of course, all of this is predicting it just amplifies the reality of what we're talking about. This was an event in history, but it was an event foretold hundreds and hundreds of years in advance, which gives it that much more credibility and supernatural implications.
Yeah, and so here David is foretelling from the Messiah's viewpoint, what crucifixion was going to be like. And his heart turns to wax. His bones are all out of joint. He's pierced through his hands and his feet. His heart turns to wax.
And the hand in that day, in the Greek and the Hebrew, the hand was considered, or the wrist was considered to be part of the hand. So
yeah, and that's where people say it was. It was like
which you can imagine the nerve there. There's a nerve there, and it's like taking your nerve here and taking pliers and just squeezing it when you insert a 7-inch spike through your wrist. A horrible, horrible way to die. They exempted Roman citizens from crucifixion. You couldn't crucify a Roman citizen because it's too awful.
Yeah, they were trying to send a message: don't screw with Rome.
Yeah.
And that's why they put him up publicly.
Yeah. I have a friend who was a GI from Vietnam and came back and was on a street corner, ran into an evangelist there, and he was Jewish, my friend, and the guy said, showed him Isaiah 53 and 52 and 53 from that John's talking about that foretold Jesus. And he said, who do you think this is talking about? And my friend Lewis said, well, Jesus, but obviously that's been doctored. Obviously it's been, So he called his a relative and said, "Send me the original, our scriptures. I want to compare." He read it and realized this is the original, and the odds of all of this coming true were so ridiculously astronomical that he received Jesus as his forgiver and leader, and he became a pastor. Louis Lapise is his name.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Well, and so what Lee was saying that Dr. Methrel said about the blood and the water.
Yeah.
So think about this. And 1,000 years before Jesus' crucifixion, it says, my heart has turned to wax within me. So what the eyewitnesses of Jesus' crucifixion say is that he was hung between two thieves, and it was on the Passover, which is also significant.
Yes.
And they came and broke the legs of the two thieves again, so they can't push up and get air.
That's how they would accelerate the death, break their legs.
Because they wanted them dead before the Passover evening began. And so the Romans said, okay, whatever. And they did. They broke their legs, but they didn't break Jesus' legs, which was another thing. Not a bone of his body was broken.
Right.
Instead, the Roman guy makes sure he's dead by stabbing him in the side. And like Lee said, John reports before the medical knowledge of this would be, he didn't know.
He didn't know the implications of what he was saying.
He said blood and water came out.
Yeah.
Okay, so what that indicates and what Lee found interviewing Dr. Methrel is when you have a heart attack, the pericardial fluid builds up. It's this clear fluid around the heart, and that's what happened. Jesus died of a heart attack. Just like Psalm 22 says, my heart has turned to wax within me.
Yeah.
And,
Wow.
And so I believe, and I don't know what you think about this, but I believe that, when Jesus cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? And he's referring to that psalm. At that moment, he experienced all of the sins and hurt and hatred and woundedness of every human for all history. He felt it.
Yeah.
and his heart couldn't take it. His human heart couldn't take it. So he didn't actually die. He died on the cross.
Yeah.
But he died from taking on all our sins and paying for them. And he, of course, was the sinless sacrifice. So this is another wild thing, is the whole sacrificial system
That's
of
right.
Judaism,
Foretells all
1,500
this.
years.
Right.
And they had to sacrifice these lambs every year to pay for and cover their sins for the year before, so that their faith in God, that he is going to pay ultimately. All right. So this whole sacrificial system happened in the temple. It could only happen in the temple, according to Moses. And the last Passover, okay, so Jesus is crucified on the Passover, which is when all this would take place, the sacrificial, yearly thing. So he dies on the Passover. And then, like we've said, 40 years later, the temple is destroyed, so no more sacrifices can happen.
Right.
So it's a conundrum for Jewish people.
And
Exactly.
And John,
where are your sins paid for? Well, it was paid for once and for all.
Right. John the Baptist pointed to Jesus and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." So he's applying this Roman or this Jewish sacrificial system to the ultimate sacrifice, who is a sinless Son of God, who would pay the sacrifice that we deserve for the sins that we've committed, and yet takes that on so that we can be forgiven.
Now, here's what's fascinating is, so I started opening up to God and faith by reading about near-death experiences because of the experiences they were having. But it was that led me to faith. And then I start studying the Bible, but I'm also curious about these near-death experiences. I'm trying to figure out, how does this fit together? And that's how I, ended up writing the books I did. But interestingly, some of the people that I've interviewed all around the world that have had near-death experiences, I think just confirm the resurrection, which, by the way, was also in Isaiah 53.
Yeah.
After he pays for their sins, he will see the light of life and be satisfied.